And hello everyone. So I'm going to talk to you today about building community assets, opportunities and challenges of the Scottish Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill. I'd like to keep in mind Peter's presentation, which has been quite a useful frame, I think, for my discussion on sort of concepts of what community is, what empowerment is, and on whose terms it's constituted. So very briefly, this is the contents of my discussion today. I'm going to talk about what we mean by community assets, provide some definitional work and background information, talk to you about the scale, geographical distribution, and the wider policy context of the current community asset agenda, and then reflecting on some of my own research and other academic research as well, reflecting on some of the key ingredients involved in developing community assets and also the challenges that are faced in supporting it. So firstly, what do we mean by assets? We're talking really about the ownership of physical assets, such as land and buildings, that are controlled, managed, and in the outright ownership of place-based community organisations. There's no uniform model of community asset organisations, nor of community assets themselves. They may be organisations may be constituted in different ways. Their assets may be acquired and funded in a variety of manners, and the assets they own will vary from sort of small-scale projects, such as the acquisition of village halls, to housing development, community facilities, land, and renewable energy schemes. The community asset organisations we're talking about here, the research undertaken for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlighted 3 different types of organisation, which I thought would be useful for context. We're talking about stewards, which would be small voluntary run groups. They would acquire a small number of assets, often for the purpose of simply maintaining them. Typical assets may be village halls or local community facilities, and they wouldn't tend to have paid staff. In the sort of middle of this typology, you'd have community developers, which would perhaps have some paid staff, would have a range of objectives, could be classed as the community anchors that Peter referred to, and will be maybe involved in sort of small-scale local service delivery and partnerships. And finally, at the sort of larger end of the scale, you might have more larger professionalised social enterprises, entrepreneurs. They may have more capital-intensive operations, paid staff, and they may be involved in sort of wider projects that seek to sort of grow and sustain local economies. And this is just really to highlight the diversity of community assets which we're talking about. Community assets are of significant scale and value already in Scotland. I'll come on to talk to you more about the modern-day policy context. But even prior to the Empowerment and Renewable Bill, we can see here that there are sort of significant scale and value. The vast majority of these assets were actually housing assets owned by community-controlled housing associations, but there's still significant assets of other community facilities in the ownership of community organisations. They're largely found in remote rural areas. This may be partly attributable to community land ownership, which I'll also talk about. And quite significantly, I think, in the context of Peter's presentation as well, a recent study on community ownership by the Development Trust Association in Scotland highlighted the geographical distribution, which highlights that community assets are overwhelmingly found in the least deprived areas of Scotland. The reasons for this may be varied and may relate to gaps in capacity or lack of aspiration or insufficient mechanisms of support. And I hope to sort of highlight these as I go on in the presentation. This table, if you ignore the spelling mistake as well, lifted from the DTA's community ownership study, also just highlights the chronology of community asset acquisitions in the last 20 years or so. You'll notice the spike around the turn of the century, which coincided with a big drive towards land reform, the introduction of the Land Reform Act. And since then, as a subsequent slide will highlight, there's been the introduction of associated funding streams and a rise in prominence for the community assets agenda, as it were. So the community assets have grown in prominence in Scotland in the last 2 decades, and I think it's important to reflect why community assets, what the benefits of community asset ownership may be. Depending on the type of assets involved, asset ownership for community organisations may be a route to income generation, particularly in an era of austerity, where grant aid and capital subsidies may be declining in availability. So the opportunity to create independent revenue streams would be quite beneficial for community organisations. Though this really depends on the type of assets, which some are obviously more likely to generate surpluses than others. But I think the driving policy terms, though, would be more orientated towards the physical and aesthetic benefits of community assets and the social benefits. In terms of physical benefits, I'm talking about sort of communities taking charge of their local areas to provide community benefit for a sort of defined group of beneficiaries. The case of community land ownership and some good research done by Madhu Satsangi at Stirling University highlights the way community land ownership has reversed local decline. It's tackled private monopolies of land and associated disinvestment and brought a multitude of benefits to communities, such as the creation of new housing, the restoration of disused or underutilised buildings, and in general providing community benefit for their local area. Community assets are also presumed to provide social benefits. They can have beneficial impacts on health and well-being. They can also provide tailored solutions that better reflect local needs, objectives and priorities of community organisations. Kim McKee's work on community-controlled housing associations that act as community anchors highlights this quite well. And there are also place-based community organisations that are called key roles to local people in democratic governance structures. They can localise decision-making and empower communities to take charge of their own destiny. And contributes to sort of the renewal and then promotion of local democracy and forms of participatory democracy, which are quite prevalent in the policy context and policy mechanisms that are currently put forward. So there are already several examples of the drive towards community assets in Scotland. The Land Reform Act in 2003 introduced the Rural Community Right to Buy, which offered a significant opportunity for rural communities to take land into community ownership. This was a preemptive right to buy, so basically when a landowner decided to sell land, rural communities would have the opportunity to purchase land before anyone else. This was coupled with the introduction of the Scottish Land Fund, which provided dedicated ring-fence funding up until 2006. This was, I think, subsumed slightly into the Big Lottery's current Growing Community Assets Fund. And as Peter mentioned, the Scottish Government is currently consulting on the Community Empowerment and Renewal Bill, which aims to roll out the right to buy to urban areas and also has other policies such as the expansion of asset transfer, which aim to expand community asset ownership. In terms of the urban right to buy and asset transfer, the ideas in the bill are currently very vague. The consultation relates to how communities in urban areas should be defined. In rural areas, this was a spatial concept, and basically, I think it was populations of 10,000 or less could purchase land. And they're also considering whether it should operate in the same way as the rural right to buy, should the right be preemptive or constituted differently. And there's also the focus on the potential for public sector assets to be transferred into community ownership, particularly where they're underutilised or disused. And I think one idea is possibly that they may be transferred at below market value, which I'll shortly touch on as well. So what are the key ingredients of community asset acquisition? Clearly, there has to be some sort of political will and political intent. By setting the rules of the game through legislation, I think government can sort of build awareness of community assets and sell the idea to communities and can create an environment in which community assets can thrive. But this isn't solely achieved through legislation. Legislation may be useful, but it's not a panacea. McLeod's review of the Land Reform Act highlighted this, the fact that actually most community land purchases have been negotiated out with the community right to buy, which has actually had a very low success rate in fulfilling land purchase for a variety of reasons, which I'll touch on in the following slide. Aside from legislation, though, I think one of the real ingredients of community asset acquisition relate to sort of the most appropriate way of resourcing and supporting communities to purchase assets and develop assets. This may include finance to support asset acquisition. That would obviously be one of the most obvious ways of supporting assets. Many people cite the Scottish Land Fund as being the sort of real drive to support land ownership as opposed to the Land Reform Act itself. But there is an awareness, I think. I recently attended an event at the Scottish Government on community asset ownership. Apologies for that skipping on. Which highlighted, at which there was really an awareness that finance isn't the only way of supporting asset acquisition, and nor do communities demand blank cheque funding, as it were. There can be scope for innovation in finance, such as revolving loan funds, but there's also the key idea of investment in other forms of support, infrastructure and partnerships that can nurture community capacity. Again, returning to the example of land reform, the Highlands and Enterprise Support Service has been hugely important in providing communities with access to technical skills, support and advice on how to undertake community land purchase. And this has been cited as one of the real sort of important factors in the growth of community land ownership in Scotland. And it's been hugely important in helping communities to navigate the process of land purchase. This has also been covered in some work that myself and Professor David Mullins at the University in Birmingham have done on community-led housing in England. We highlighted the importance of intermediary organisations that perform the bridging role between communities and the public and private sectors and other partners in the third sector to help nurture community capacity and help communities deliver their objectives. We also found really that the identification of partnerships really is crucial to the success of community asset ownership. Partners that have distinct but complementary roles are fundamental to successful community asset ownership by providing access to certain skills and support. Communities don't operate in a silo, and the sort of wider infrastructure and partnerships are important. A key ingredient, though, also, as well as community-led desire and community capacity, and also a realism as to where communities fit in strategically from local and national government perspectives. There needs to be a desire from the community and a genuine desire to see things through, as asset acquisition and ownership can be a lengthy, time-consuming process, which asks a lot of community members and volunteers. It also needs to be considered where and how it fits in with strategic plans for the local area, and to realise that whether it's that community ownership itself isn't a panacea, whether assets are in the ownership of communities or public sector or private sector or other third sector organisations, there are still sort of demands of financial viability and management issues as well. And obviously this really depends on the type of assets you're referring to, but there's communities essentially face the same barriers, challenges in asset management and development as other partners in public and private sectors. So there are also many challenges to the community assets, the growth of community assets in Scotland. As my previous slide highlighted, the geographical distribution is currently highlights that the overwhelmingly community assets are found in the least deprived areas of Scotland. And this, obviously, I'd like to bear in mind Peter's previous presentation on this as well. It's an important frame and important material to draw on there. And there's probably significant challenges to be overcome if asset agendas are to take root across the nation. The constitutional impact of legislation, returning to the example of land reform, legislation needs to be configured in an appropriate way. Land reform reviews, the research I referred to by MacLeod, highlight the way that bureaucratic processes that have centralised controls and can cause lengthy delays to community ownership can disincentivise community-led approaches. Legislation needs to offer a genuine and realistic avenue for communities to achieve their objectives, not place onerous demands that may stifle community innovation. But nor can it ask too much of communities, and there has to be sort of a realism as to what communities can actually achieve through asset ownership, and also the wider impact this will have beyond their localities. A challenge of community engagement and the wider challenges of empowerment. That I won't reiterate exactly what Peter said, but that relates to who are you empowering? Are you empowering the powerful? And if so, what happens to those unable to articulate their own needs? But equally as well, regardless, space and time needs to be given for communities to engage and involve their community. Asset acquisition is laden with sort of democratic potential and seen to be able to empower local communities. But active citizen participation and engagement takes time. And I think this is especially important when thinking about the possible urban right to buy. For example, in rural areas, communities are often easily defined due to their sort of cohesive nature and often isolated nature. In urban areas, it's essentially a lot more messy, and they're not so easily defined. Skills, resources, and desires of communities. Skills and resources can and are, as Peter has highlighted, unevenly distributed within and between communities. Asset acquisition, management, and ownership places heavy demands on those who are involved. And engagement with intermediary support services can help ease these burdens, but it's important to understand asset ownership may not be for every community. To offer the opportunity to all, there does need to be that intermediary support and availability of wider infrastructure. And again, returning to the example of land reform, the Highlands and Enterprise Service has been fundamental to that. And other areas in Scotland where there may not be many community assets, there is a sort of correlation between the availability of these sort of wider support services. The research undertaken for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation also highlighted the fact that assets can actually become liabilities as well. Ultimately, assets still need to be managed in a financially viable and responsible way. To return to the ideas behind asset transfer, I think the Empowerment and Renewal Bill actually speaks of the transfer of disused and underutilised assets from public ownership into community ownership. But it should be acknowledged that while communities can provide innovative solutions and contribute to wider regeneration agendas, ultimately there may be some assets that may turn into liabilities, and by simply transferring it into community ownership, it doesn't necessarily become more profitable or financially viable. And furthermore, not all communities will want to take ownership of assets. Many will be happy with the current service they get from public providers. There may not be demand for asset transfer or wider asset ownership. And it's important to recognise that this demand does need to come from the bottom up and from communities. There's a multitude of research that shows that essentially the incentives of community development, or community asset development, relate to the benefits that can be accrued for the immediate local community. And it's not necessarily always about demanding a better service because it's from the community. Community assets can have positive effects, but they're not for every locality. And can we realistically expect communities to fill gaps in wider provision that was perhaps traditionally provided by the public sector or private sector, particularly in an era of austerity? And finally, a particular challenge is the fit community asset ownership has with wider policies and strategies. It needs to fit into the wider piece, the wider story. Essentially, it needs to be complementary to the wider issues and the wider plans for the local area. For example, in terms of the push for public asset transfer and the discussions about whether assets should be transferred at below market value, at a recent event I attended, there was concerns that this may conflict with wider legislation regarding state aid, which is when the state provides financial assistance to certain providers, and whether this conflicts with competition rules at European level. So clearly, it needs to be these sorts of issues need to be taken into account. Community asset ownership doesn't operate in a silo, removed from these wider policies and strategies. And to conclude, in terms of the implications this may have for the sort of currently quite vague proposals in the Empowerment and Renewal Bill, there's obviously much that's positive about the community asset agenda, in terms of the benefits it can provide for localities, the possible improvements to local services or to the wider community, and the opportunity to boost the local resilience of communities as well. But it's not the only or always the most desirable option, and needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis. It needs to recognise that the needs and objectives of every community are not always the same. Different solutions on a bespoke basis are probably required for different areas. Asset ownership isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. History shows, and a wealth of research highlights, that asset ownership also, as well, is not a cheap option. It requires stable, dedicated and targeted resourcing. There are several examples of support services already at national level, and such as the Development Trust Association, the Community Land Scotland Umbrella Coalition, and the Highlands and Enterprise Support Services. And any proposals for the Empowerment and Renewal Bill do need to tap into these existing support services and perhaps learn from their experiences in understanding how asset ownership could be expanded across Scotland. But resourcing isn't necessarily or solely about asking for grant aid. It's about ensuring the appropriate infrastructure is in place and that communities fit into these wider strategic agendas as well as ensuring that legislation or any support policies are constituted on a basis that doesn't stifle community innovation. And ultimately, community ownership transcends who and where we are. Communities don't operate in these silos, and any new legislation needs to be accompanied by a recognition of this. Creative connections have to be made with wider partners in the public, private and third sectors if community assets are to take off across Scotland. And with that, I will hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.